Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are receiving this lecture. I am so glad that you could join me. And yes, I do actually wear glasses. I have to have them on at this time, mainly because I've been staring at a screen for half of the day. So, in order to just give my eyes that little bit of help, just wanted you guys to make sure that you knew that it was me, not an imposter. So I hope everybody is doing well. I did want to first thank you for the submissions for your critical analysis paper. I am going to be taking a look at those this week, and I should have comments to you. I really am just looking forward to seeing how you're analyzing, whichever question you decided to answer. But just so that you know that those questions that were posed on there, those should give you an indicator of what you should expect for the midterm. It'll be very similar. But I'll discuss more of that, as we go forward. But for this week, what we are going to be covering is World War II. So if you recall from last week, we ended with the effects of the Great Depression, namely the social anxiety that develops as a consequence of an extended period of economic malaise, so to speak, right? So when you have less of a sense of, direction, right? You're unsure about how you're going to pay your bills. Are you going to be able to get a job? Are you going to have enough food to eat, right? These conditions, these social conditions create a space where people really begin to question the direction of a country. And it opens up the door for leadership, for individuals that, seem to have the answer, but are not necessarily as scrutinized as they would during a time when things are going well, right? Because of your condition, right? You may be without a job. Maybe you're on the brink of losing your home. Maybe you just can't, find, the next meal or how you're going to support your family. That opens yourself up to some severe vulnerabilities, meaning that your judgment may be impaired because you're so focused on being able to make sure that you're going to survive that you often put your trust into people that you don't necessarily know everything about. And so where we left is we left where America was going through this tumultuous period where it was really trying to figure out the direction of the country, right? Were we going to go into um, a more reformed period of capitalist democracy? Were we going to try communism? Were we going to try some sort of form of fascism? Whether that was an organization like the German American Bund, which was looking at, basically creating an American version of Nazism, and or maybe that was to borrow some of the ideas of the fascist dictatorship like Mussolini that was taking place in Italy. And largely this was because of what was seen as quote unquote success that was happening in Europe, right? Now, of course, like all dictators and tyrannical leaders, they have the ability in which to sort of fudge the numbers and to say whatever is going on in their country is good, right? One of the things that many Americans were drawn to was this quote unquote success of their economic models that were happening in both Italy and in Germany. But the reality was is that you had to take the word of the Nazi officials that everything was great. And remember, although I know that it is, well, maybe not so difficult at this moment, given the strong influence of the far right in the current administration, as well as in the political mindsets of many Americans in this country, to adopt an approach of fascism, like even sort of a Nazification of American politics at the time in the 1930s, was not something that was well established, right? Kristallnacht, in terms of the persecution of the Jews, had not happened yet. That's going to happen in 1937. The war that'll happen, in for World War II, the invasion of Poland in 1939, none of that has happened yet, right? So we have hindsight to be able to say to ourselves, well, why would anybody be attracted to this, right? And so I think that that's one of the really key aspects that I want you to think about is like, well, why exactly would people in this moment, right? If we look at the, 20 2024 election, like why exactly would somebody, why would a group of Americans, we're talking about 70 plus million of them, vote for an individual like Donald Trump, knowing what he had already done, right? Is it because of where people were economically? Are they questioning the direction of America? And what we can see in much of the data is that the generation, especially the millennial generation and Generation X, is that they are not as sanguine about American institutions as perhaps their parents or their grandparents were, right? That the ideas in terms of what exactly you know, keeps a country bound together is not as clear. There's not necessarily these superimposing ideologies that somehow unify us, right? There's far more individuality that governs people's thoughts and minds. And so when you have people that are questioning their outcomes and their situations, rather than looking at the totality of the country, right? It can be very easy to grasp onto people like a Donald Trump who speaks to you in, slogans of make America great again. We're going to, build the wall. We're going to create, this American comeback, right? Sounds good, but it doesn't really have many details. But if that's what's going to get somebody to just be able to buy in without having really being able to critique that, it makes us susceptible to being controlled. And I think that that's where we want to take a look at where we are going into World War II. So as we are leaving this period, right, when we're coming out of or still within the Great Depression, right? What I'm going to do is in this lecture is I'm going to give you some background as to how World War II starts, particularly starting with Europe, because I want you to understand how Europe starts, how the conflict in Asia starts, then how we get involved, and then the effects of it. I'm not going to be going into a lot of the battles, right? This isn't a World War II history course. If you want to, look at some of those, I'm going to put up some documentaries and some other links, and you can find, everything that you want about the battles themselves. But we'll be looking at the effects of America's role in World War II, right? The effects abroad, the effects at home, right? The changes for various groups in society, and then ultimately where America comes out after the end of the war in 1945. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So let me just give you some background, brief as it may be. And any of these, remember these links that are yellow, or gold, whatever color it may come up on your screen. Feel free to click on the videos or the link to give you some more information. But when we take a look at the conflict in Europe, where we have to begin is in 1919. So remember, World War I ends. Europe is largely decimated. Factories are destroyed. Agricultural production has ended because ground has been left fallow for several years because of war. And remember, the labor that once existed has been decimated because people have been killed in war. So there's a physical loss, there's a traumatic loss, there's an economic loss. And so Europe is in a severe situation. Now, of course, in 1919, there is this agreement that is made to basically bring the war to a formal end. And it's what is known as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, you can take a look at the details of it, but to just sum it up real simply is that Germany, who was blamed for this war because they were the ones who started it, that was the argument, is that the European countries and nations who were at this treaty were going to make them pay for it, right? They're not only going to have to pay reparations because of what they caused, but they're going to lose territory and they're going to have military restrictions. Now, all of that combined from 1919 all the way up until the election of Adolf Hitler in 1932, and then eventually when he takes over the chancellorship in 1933 and turns, the once democracy of Germany into an authoritarian regime under the Nazis, right? This is what contributes to it, right? Because remember what the United States was experiencing during 1919 to 1929, that period of 10 years was a boom period, right? The economy is growing at one of the fastest rates. We have the people, we have the resources, we have the factories and the capital. We can make it happen. We're producing cars, radios, refrigerators, right? Any sort of factory good, luxury items, right? Things are going well in the United States. In Europe, not so much. This is a prolonged period of depression, right? so the depression that the United States will go through from 1929 until roughly about 1937, Germany was going through one from 1919 all the way up roughly until about 1932. Okay. So they have their own depression. And remember, this depression is actually, we're talking continent wide for much of Europe. And so this creates social anxiety. This creates a questioning. It creates a blaming, like what is going on? And it opens up Germany, as well as Italy, as well as other countries to leaders that they don't fully understand and what eventually will turn into World War II, right? Under people like Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, or even in the 1930s, Franco in Spain, right? There's all of these examples of how authoritarian dictators really take over or come into power during periods of extreme social anxiety. Okay, so the second was that, as I mentioned, economic instability, prolonged economic instability. We have the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, right? Something that is able to garner huge support because people bought into this idea that what had happened as a result of the Treaty of Versailles was an affront. It took away German self-respect. It took away their individual uh, identity. It took away their national hopes, right? All of these aspects. And then finally, as the nation of Germany is trying to rebuild itself in the early 1930s, what you have here is you see that there is a greater amount of national aggression, right? A greater willingness to assert oneself on the world stage, as well as the areas along its borders that had once been a part of its territory, but were taken back because of the Treaty of Versailles. It is a process known as appeasement. And there's a great article, if you click on it, you can actually take a look at the process of appeasement that really Great Britain and France were willing to extend to Germany as a way to try to avoid war. Appeasement, generally speaking, people, is that, well, if you give somebody what they want, maybe they'll back off and it can lead to, peace talks, or it can lead to, more agreements, and we don't necessarily have to create a wider war. Unfortunately, we don't need many examples, not just from World War II, as appeasement doesn't work. You can look and see what's going on right now in Eastern Europe, right? With Russia's war and its aggression on Ukraine. They had already taken the Donbass region, and they had already taken Odessa and the Crimean area during the term of President Obama. The idea of allowing Russia to just be able to secede territory from one of its, non-aggressor neighbors, this idea of appeasement doesn't work. Case in point, the crisis and the war in Ukraine. Here it is going on to year 4, right? It doesn't work. So the only way to answer appeasement is by physical force. But most individuals, as you can see, the United States being one of them, is not interested in getting involved in a war, right? And that was the same thing in the 1930s. People in the 1930s, children that had been born on the eve of World War I, so basically 1919, 1920, were just now old enough to fight in World War II. So if you think about that, there was a lot of reasons for not wanting to get involved because an entire generation was now about to be lost. However, as Great Britain and France will, quickly realize as the 30s continue, is that the appeasement aspect only makes Germany hungry, even hungrier for more power, right? And so this is what's eventually going to happen, is that when that appeasement aspect fails, this idea that, well, how can we stop Germany from asserting itself? That means us getting involved. We don't necessarily have a military. We don't have the power to be able to stop them. What are we supposed to do? This only allows Germany to get stronger and stronger. One of the things that's very important for all y'all to understand, just as a side point, is that Germany was prevented from being able to rearm its military, okay, under the formal provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. But the way that they got around it is by this, is that instead of having a factory that's just dedicated to building planes or tanks or military grade weapons, what they did is they created a specialization all around the country. And so one city way over here in, let's say, Cologne would make, like, let's say, the gears for the engine, and then another place would make the propeller for the plane. Another place would actually build the wings and the sheeting and all this other stuff, and would basically be all over the country. And then those pieces would be brought and assembled somewhere to one area, right? Now, of course, what it does is that it keeps within line the Treaty of Versailles because, well, no, we're not making weapons. We're only making airplane wings. I'm not making a weapon. I'm making an engine. I'm making this, right? And so, if anybody really wanted to ask, they could be like, well, of course not. That's not what we're doing. So what it did was it hid Germany's rearmaments plans, right? And it basically caught the British off guard because this is the reason why Europe was so easily able to come under the control of Germany, because many people had just simply underestimated what was happening in the 1930s. Okay. And then finally, with the war starting in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Now, of course, there is the taking over of the Sudetenland by Germany in 1937, I believe it is. But correct me if I'm wrong. Somebody else, check that up. It might have been earlier. But just to give you guys a sense that the reason why the invasion of Poland is considered the start of World War II is because that is when Great Britain and France declare war on Nazi Germany, and then the war starts in Europe. Okay, shifting to Asia, much different. Um, Japan at this time in the 1930s has been asserting itself for the last decade or so on the continent of Asia. So Japan is an island, and it has basically been using its military prowess to be able to conquer various other islands in the Pacific region, as well as establishing itself on the mainland of China. So how it does this is very simply. So China at the time was had various, I guess you could call them like proto-democracies, but more like a warlord system. At the time, democracy was tried to be established in the early 20th century. It collapses, but I won't get into all that. Here's the point, is that Japan basically looked at an opportunity and said that, you know what, we can basically assert ourselves because not only do we have the capacity to do it from our military that we've been building up, but we also believe that we're just morally and racially superior to every single one of you on this Asian continent. It basically belongs to us. And so they do this basically through colonialism, is that they take over the Korean Peninsula, establish a, puppet protectorate, essentially. They do the same thing in northern part of China, known as Manchuria, using the puppet emperor Puyi, which basically leads them into a series of proxy wars on the continent, namely the rape of Nanking in 1937. And you might want to take a look at this link. There's a video here. It is quite long, but if you just want to get some background on that, the rape of Nanking is not often taught in American classrooms. We do teach the Holocaust, but the rape of Nanking is essentially the Asian Holocaust. Okay. This is one where we're talking some of the most brutal tactics on civilians by the Japanese military were, done to the Chinese population. We're talking rapes and killings of women and children. We're talking massive graves, literally just, bombing civilians, killing civilians, using chemical warfare on civilians, all sorts of, just some of the most despicable forms of violence on humans. And so, take a look, because what it does is it gives you a little bit more perspective in terms of, like, the costs and the tragedies and the traumas that come out of war. But the other area about how we get involved in this specifically, because remember, we don't get involved in the European theater of war until much later. 1941, 42 is when we get, truly involved, but we are brought into the Asian conflict because of the bombing that will happen at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. But the reason for that bombing was because of our economic sanctions and trade embargoes that we were imposing on Japan, basically to limit its expansionistic territorial desires in the Pacific. Okay. As early as the as early as like 1933, 1934, the United States was already putting trade embargoes on on Japan and basically not selling it oil, not selling it steel. Why is that? Well, because Japan as an island has very little abilities to produce. So in order for it to be able to become a military might, it has to have resources, it has to have access to oil, has to have access to steel, has to have access to, agricultural resources. It needs all of these things. And if it doesn't have this on the island, it needs to get them from somewhere else. So therefore is what you had the expansionist aspect. But the United States was already trying to put the kibosh on that and limit its opportunities by imposing embargoes and not selling it steel or oil. This would eventually set it up into conflict because if the Japanese feel, as they did in 1941, that the United States was preventing it from being able to secure its oil reserves in the region, it was going to go on the attack. The attack was not inevitable, as I will discuss with you, but this is just something to know. So that's basically how it happens. Okay. So cool. But prior to 1941, before we get involved, you already heard me talk about how the United States is already semi-involved, right? Similar to World War One, we're very well aware of the conflict that's happening in Europe and we're aware of what's going on in Asia, but we're not really interested in getting involved. We're once again taking an isolationist position. Um, not that we're not interested in world affairs, and while it may not be the extreme as it was like in during World War One, this is a position that the United States is just not really interested in taking. Why? Because most of the population just isn't interested in getting involved. However, the United States was getting involved in terms of supporting the Allies. One of the best examples is what is known as the Destroyers for Bases deal. So, one of the things that the United States entered into agreements with Great Britain was to provide military grade weapons as well as military ships and submarines to the British, as well as sharing an intelligence in exchange for access to their military airfields so that we would be able to help defend ourselves in the case of an attack that might come from Europe. Um, so as early as like 1940, we had produced a bunch of naval destroyers that the British could lease and that they could use them. The Lend-Lease Act in 1941 allowed us to supply, goods, military grade weapons, aircraft, tanks, machine guns, all the raw materials that you would need to be able to fight a war. And so eventually we become what is known as like the arsenal of democracy, right? We can supply you the tools, all the goods and services that you're going to need to be able to fight your war. We're just not supporting them. We're not supporting it with men. Now, of course, Great Britain under Winston Churchill was trying to get the United States involved, right? It was pretty it was pretty clear early on that the British and the French were going to have some serious trouble fighting back the Nazi threat. And so, the United States was reluctant. They were going to offer everything that they could to try to help out, but eventually we will get pulled into this war in 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Okay. And so let's take a look at how we formally get into the war. Let me just move this down so you can see that for a second. Okay. Um, in 1941, December 7th, 1941, there is an attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, um, of course, the public thought it was a surprise attack, and of course, the United States government was going to play that because it plays well with the population. However, it wasn't the biggest surprise in the world, given the Japanese aggression that was already happening in the Pacific. While it was not exactly one of the clearest targets that Japan was going to take in terms of the military outpost in Hawaii, it wasn't completely out of mind and it was a possibility. And so there was the United States caught off guard. Were we unprepared? Certainly. Why? Because we didn't necessarily have enough planes. We didn't have enough tanks. Remember, everything that we were making was being sent to Europe. And so it wasn't necessarily something that we were prepared for to enter into war. Now, do we have the materials and everything to do that? Sure, we do. But we needed to build all of them. So basically what happens is that when that speech that's given by President uh, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to the Congress, it's very famous. You'll hear it. It's like he says, "On December the 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy." You've heard that. So he says that, and then of course, then the Congress decides to pass a declaration of war on Japan the next day. Um, as a result of this, because Japan is part of the axis of powers, Germany and Italy, and Japan, this creates Germany and Italy to declare war on the United States several days later. And so then that's how we get drawn into the European theater of war. Okay. So once this happens, there's going to be some major, major shifts in the economy. Why? Because in order for the United States to be able to fight this war, remember, this is a war on two fronts. You've got one in the Pacific, one in Europe. And so this is going to require the efforts and resources of the entire country. The entire country is going to have to be pulled into this. So it's not just establishing a selective service, meaning that people are going to be drafted into the war, but we're talking about industrial conversion. Every single car company, every single manufacturing company was put under this control of basically the federal government to be able to produce goods and services for the war. So we're no longer producing cars. We're producing airplanes. We're producing Jeeps. We are producing tanks. We are producing everything for the war effort. If, what you would do is that this gets everybody involved into it. So we're talking about an entire retooling of every single manufacturing company that basically would be put into the war effort. So think about that. Think about that. Like we're not talking about, you know, so if you had a clothing company, right, you're now making uniforms. If you may be making helmets, maybe you are making, the backpacks or the mess kits, whatever the case may be. Maybe you're a shoe company, you're making boots, right? We're not doing the shoes anymore, right? So everybody was expected to get into this. The second thing, then what also happens is that we need expansion in terms of the military, in terms of its naval, its army, as well as the air force, right? So these three areas have to be, you know, properly equipped. So we have the retooling, we're going to get all of the goods, and then we get the people, we're going to get the organization, we're going to get ourselves together so that we are able to fight on both fronts. In terms of mobilization, right, we're going to be preparing everybody for war, right? So you saw the factories themselves being preparing everybody for war, but then also the public, right? The public is encouraged to participate in this. And there's actually a really interesting, um, well, that's kind of interesting. Oh, here we go. Let me actually pause this for you so you can hear it. So you can hear what the contributions were during this time. And you have to put the volume on. There we go. And there
During World War II, American women made enormous contributions to the war effort. Yet much of their fighting wasn't on the battlefront, but on the home front. Their home front activities offered challenges and opportunities never available before to women.
And actually, I want to show you guys that video in just a second because I think there's actually more important aspects. Not that that's not important, but that's important. Let me just keep that one up there for you guys for just a second. Okay. Um, In terms of getting everybody involved in the public, we'll talk about the role of women. We're going to talk about the victory gardens. We're going to talk about, the resources in terms of turning in whatever you have for scrap metal so they can be used to build destroyers or tanks, right? And so what you're going to look at is you're going to look at how all of everything is centralized around war making production, war making strategy, war making powers. Everybody's involved in this. And so no one group was isolated from participating in this because it was a totalizing effect, right? We're talking about a war effort where the people, the resources, all of the goods and services, our entire being was going to be thrown into this war. Okay, so let's go on to the next. And so before I get into the details, actually, I'm going to skip this one and we'll come back to this one. So let's take a look at some of the groups. Okay. Let's go back and let's take a look at the women in terms of some of their contributions that were made during the war. So let me go ahead and play back this video and let me turn the volume up.
During World War II, American women made enormous contributions to the war effort. Yet much of their fighting wasn't on the battlefront, but on the home front. Their home front activities offered challenges and opportunities never available before to women. Even everyday tasks took on greater meaning and depth. The contributions of millions of American women on the home front were vital. They helped win World War II. Women ran their homes and cared for their families amid challenging wartime rationing of materials and food that affected most aspects of their daily lives. But they did much more. Women worked in factories to produce military equipment, helped care for wounded soldiers, and provided emotional support for troops. They grew victory gardens in the city and cultivated crops on America's farms, feeding those at home and on the battlefront. Women even flew airplanes. The garments displayed on these mannequins represent just some of the stories of millions of American women during World War II. When America entered the war, male military pilots were in short supply, so women stepped in to fill the void. More than 1,000 women learned to fly, then joined the Women Air Force Service pilots, known as WASPs. These women ferried planes from factories to military bases, tested newly repaired planes, transported equipment and personnel, and towed gunnery targets, releasing men for combat duty overseas. This suit belonged to Ellen Roddice, a college student who decided to learn to fly, perhaps inspired by the contributions of the WASPs. So, why the stylish suit? Ellen Roddice wore it when she married her flight instructor in March 1945. The labor force shrank as men left to join the military. Just as American industry was gearing up to produce planes, jeeps, tanks, bombs, and guns, America called on women to take up the slack. Millions did, heeding the call to do the job he left behind. Rosie the Riveter, a fictional character who embodied the ideal woman defense industry worker, came to represent these women. These sturdy garments, manufactured under the U.S. War Production Board, were made for women working on farms or in the factories. More than 3.5 million women volunteered for the Red Cross. It was a popular way to do your part for the war effort. These women assisted medical personnel in stateside military hospitals and helped boost patient morale. They made surgical dressings, collected blood donations, and provided first aid training in communities nationwide. Volunteers also shipped care packages to prisoners of war in Europe and the Far East and to soldiers at home and abroad. Red Cross volunteers worked in many capacities, including motor corps, nurses' aides, and home service. Each corps had a distinctive uniform. Hospital and recreation volunteers wore gray uniforms with a white cap and a gray veil. The United Service Organizations, known as the USO, provided welcome recreation for troops. The USO operated approximately 3,000 clubs in the United States, where women volunteered as hostesses, dancing with servicemen, playing cards or ping pong, or serving donuts and coffee. Some servicemen just wanted to talk or share photographs of loved ones, so the women often lent an understanding ear to soldiers who were homesick or lonely. In 1945, Detroit's AFL USO committee organized a series of weekend social activities for convalescing servicemen from Percy Jones Hospital, a military hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan. One of the hostesses who provided companionship for these soldiers during dinner, dancing, or visits to local points of interest was Wilma Carrico, who wore this dress. Four years of war would change traditional notions of what a woman could accomplish. Since then, women have continued to challenge that thinking, participating in society in ways once unimaginable.
God, how cool is that, right? So, women, once given an opportunity, right? Once an opportunity opens, women take advantage of it, and not only do they excel, but they thrive. And so, when we look at World War II, right? What we see is that much like during World War One, an opportunity for women to take on positions that had previously been shut out, right? But because there is a need for workers, right? A need for people to fulfill labor and responsibilities to keep the war effort going, women fill this void. Okay. And so what is fascinating is that we're talking about millions of women decide to take up this call, right? And many of these women still had children, right? They still had a home that they had to take care of, right? There are great examples of women that would go to work at either some of the shipyards in Richmond, California, or here in Baltimore, or down on the Gulf Coast, right? And they would drop their children off at, these local daycare centers that are being run by either one of the factories or the shipyards or the military, and drop their kids off so that they can go to work and then come back around 5 o'clock and pick their kids back up, take them home, cook, and do everything else, right? So once again, women are demonstrating that not only can they take on the job of, fitting the rivets, to a plane, or to build a engine for, a truck, or to, fly an airplane across the country so that it can be prepared for shipment to Asia or to Europe, is that they're still taking care of their duties here, right? Whether they're serving in parts of the USO, or they're serving as nurses, or they're serving in these capacities. Women take on these new jobs, right? And that Rosie the Riveter that you see, that is so often, used as the, legit, poster image of the ideal, 1940s woman, of being able to say that we can do it and participate, is really that foundation for women to once again take their places into areas where not only have they been denied, but that they can also thrive, right? Thrive in terms of moving beyond these spheres of domesticity, right? Into areas where they can serve and excel, take on leadership positions, organizational skills, the ability in which to work under extreme pressure, right? To attention to detail, right? All of these areas that are, that were once thought to be like, well, it's just out of their capacity. Look at what happens. And yes, is it clear that the war could not have been won without women? Absolutely. right? It's not just women's labor, it's women's contributions, it's women's support, right? Women are much like every group that is labeled as being, unable or unwilling or, just not enough, always demonstrate time and time again, generation after generation, that they have the skills, the abilities, and the wherewithal to be able to make not just incredible contributions, but to actually put our group, our country, our society over the edge in terms of achievement. Okay. And so what's fascinating is that it's not just the fashion that changes for women. It's not just the jobs that they take on. It's not just the skills that they develop, but that this period of coming out of the 1940s is really what's going to be able to further build upon the movements that are going to be happening in the late 1950s, 60s, and of course into the 1970s, where women will once again be able to take that which they had learned, that which they were able to do, all those aspects that demonstrated their capacity to be able to perform, not just to be the equals of men in these jobs, but actually superior in many regards of their abilities and skills. And so this is what's going to push back against those restrictions that are going to reassert themselves after the war, right? There's going to be this expectation that women are going to return back to the kitchen and that they're going to return back to this life of domesticity and being able to wait hand and foot on their husbands, right? Well, what we're going to see is that in that period of the 50s, as much as, Leave It to Beaver and, Ozzie and Harriet and all those, fake propaganda, Miss Perfect 1952, movies will try to, inundate you with, the reality is that many women kept their jobs, right? That many women still continued to work. Women still continued to take care of the family. Women still continued. Even when they were pushed out, they still made new spaces for themselves. And so this is what's going to be the foundation of all of those future movements is that women never stopped achieving. Right? There's this sense that like, oh, as soon as the war is over in 1945 and 46, time to go back to the kitchen, Betty Sue. But the reality is that Betty Sue and all of her sisters are going to keep going forward, right? Regardless of what the propaganda may say during the 1950s, women are still going to make some serious strides. Okay. Now, it's not just women. Okay. It's not just women that are, finding new opportunities in terms of where can I put this little camera there? Okay. Let me just move this over here. Okay. It's not just women that are going to be making these contributions. It's also African Americans. Now remember, Jim Crow segregation is the standard, right? We still have de facto segregation that is going on in the North and the West, right? Many of the jobs that were opening up, to women, in this period were still largely cut off to African American men and women, right? That they weren't able to have the same opportunities, right? They couldn't necessarily go into the same aspects, and so it's very important for us to look at not just like what we saw in 1917 with African Americans, deciding whether or not to participate. Same thing again happens in during World War II in 1941, right? There is a question, right, from many African American leaders and the African American populace to be like, well, why should we contribute to this? Contributed during World War I, and look at where it got us. A country that still has not outlawed lynching, a country that still has not outlawed segregation, a country that still does not protect its own people here, but will fight for democracy abroad. No, thank you, please. Right? These are the sort of questions that once again happen. But despite that, you still had close to 3 million African American men, black men, register, right? To participate. Some of the most famous ones that you've heard of is, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 761 tank battalion, right? That was, labeled by FDR and then Truman. No, excuse me, by Truman as extraordinary heroism. Right, we're looking at aspects in terms of incredible contributions. Once again, But what this does is that there's also an important aspect in terms of movement. Remember, in 1917, we talked about that first migration, the Great Migration One, that happens from the South to areas like, Tennessee and Kentucky and parts of Washington, D.C., Chicago, and New York. Well, here we have a second Great Migration, right? Another one where people are once again moving from the South to the North, right? Same areas again, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, but we also see huge influx of migrations out west, right? Especially to the areas of Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area, by African Americans. And so, many of the Black communities that are, developed, that come out of the, 1970s and 1980s, especially in areas like Oakland, Richmond, the area like the Fillmore district in San Francisco. All of these areas are the result of Black migration, right? And so if you know anybody in these areas, chances are the many of the people that I grew up with, their grandparents had come out to Oakland, had come out to San Francisco, had come out to areas of, even Southern California in the 1940s. And many of them took the train. The train stop, the last stop on the Pacific Railroad was in Oakland, California, actually in West Oakland, California. The train depot is still there to this day. No, it is not in use. It hasn't been used for many decades, but it is a historical monument. It's actually still kind of run down. They haven't been able to, fix it up to make it, pristine, so that people can see how important that was. But um, it was an important destination just for its physicality, but also for the routes that it took along the way. Because remember, along those routes, right, and along those stations of the train travel, the people who are traveling, especially if they're traveling one of the sleeper cars, um, they are being manned and basically treated to some of the best service in the country by the Pullman porters. And the Pullman porters were an established, you could call them an elite group of Black railroad workers. These are individuals who created incredible experiences for passengers who were crossing from one end of the country to the other. But this was one of the first groups to actually unionize during this period under A. Philip Randolph. And this in the 1940s is one of the first areas where you actually get a push to actually, call American leaders to task in terms of holding themselves accountable to this quote unquote American dream of equality before the law and equality of opportunity. When you're looking at a person like A. Philip Randolph who saw that black labor was absolute necessity for the war effort. He was one of the first individuals after having the successful campaign of unionizing the Pullman Porters Union, or helping to create the Pullman Porters Union. He would go on with other black leaders to push for the integration or the desegregation of military factories, or factories that had received military contracts. And this is done under FDR as a result of this. Um, while yes, military organizations, the military itself is not desegregated, there are still segregated units. There is a push to legalize segregation within organizations that are receiving military contracts for the war. This is tried in several different places. It does work, and there is, integration in areas such as out west and up north. However, in the South, there was a huge amount of conflict. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you why exactly that is, but essentially, the even with the orders to be able to make sure that there is equal opportunity and to desegregate, the conflict that continued to arise between workers was just too great that it actually delayed war production. So many of the companies actually still remained segregated, although there were African American workers doing the exact same job as white workers. So they're doing the same job in the same areas, but they are segregated because of the conflicts that continually to arose every single time the companies tried to integrate, right? And so this is one of those areas where we see once again a constant push. There's an expansion of an opportunity, then there's a contraction of it, right, in real time. And so for African Americans, this is for many people and historians, is that they often look at World War II as the dawning of the modern civil rights movement. Because what we will have in the 1950s is we will have all of those famous movements that many of you are familiar with: Brown versus Board, Supreme Court decision. You're going to see the Montgomery bus boycott, right? All of these areas. And so, but this is a consequence of what happens during World War II in terms of the desegregation of the military, opening up of the civil service, opportunities in terms of, wartime production. Okay. So we just want to try to understand that this is another fundamental change of what is taking place. Okay. Okay. So, in order for, one of the things that I want to be able to, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to do this in another lecture for you guys because I think that's another area. But in the next one, what we'll do is we're going to cover hysteria in World War II in terms of how this creates people, in terms of the sense of why they need to fight or what they need to get involved with. And we're going to look and see how this affects various groups: women, African Americans, as well as Jews, and try to understand how this dynamic in terms of hysteria is still very much used today by people like Donald Trump. So, like, you'll see what has happened with the shooting of the boats off the coast of Venezuela or Colombia, what's happening right now in Iran, right? We will take a look at all of these things. So, take a look at this and then take a look for lecture number 2.